The night on Vesker 9 was colder than anything Rava had ever felt in her life. The wind pushed against her like a living beast trying to knock her down. Every breath she took came out as white mist that froze before it even faded. The endless snow stretched in all directions, swallowing the world in darkness. Rava held her baby, Luro, tight against her chest. His small body was wrapped in the last warm cloth she owned, but even that was losing its heat. His skin, once bright silver, had turned pale gray, a color no child should ever have. His breathing was slow, weak, almost silent. It terrified her more than the storm itself. Her legs trembled with every step. She could no longer feel her feet. It felt like she was walking on knives made of ice. The storm screamed in her ears, as if warning her that no one survived nights like this. Rava had heard the stories since childhood. Families frozen together, travelers lost forever, shapes hidden in the blizzard that took the living. But she refused to let her story end here. She refused to lose her child. Snowflakes landed on Luro's little face. She quickly brushed them away with shaking fingers. Her vision blurred. Her head spun. She whispered to him again and again, begging him to stay awake. He didn't answer. The world around her was nothing but white. White snow, white sky, white death. She tried calling out for help, but the wind tore her voice away instantly. She was alone, completely alone. A sharp gust hit her from the side, knocking her to her knees. She cried silently, her tears freezing on her cheeks. Her arms wrapped around Luro tighter, trying to shield him, trying to give him the last pieces of warmth she still carried. Cold stabbed through her clothes, cutting to her bones. Her heartbeat slowed. Her eyelids grew heavy. She whispered Luro's name one last time, hoping it would keep her awake. Then she heard it. A tiny sound. A weak, soft cry from her child. It gave her strength she did not know she had. She forced herself to stand again, pushing through the deep snow that reached her knees. Every step felt impossible, but she kept moving. Then, she thought she saw something far away. A small glow. A warm color in the middle of the frozen darkness. She blinked over and over, trying to make sure it wasn't just her mind playing tricks. The light flickered, faint but real. She reached for it with her eyes, her body barely holding together. Luro's breathing slowed again, and panic stabbed her heart. She hugged him as close as she could, whispering apologies, whispering love, whispering hope. Her legs buckled. She sank into the snow. Her vision began to fade at the edges. She kissed her child's forehead, feeling how cold he had become. Too cold. Just before her eyes closed completely, a shape appeared through the storm. Not a creature, not a shadow, something carrying a soft, warm light. It moved closer, closer. She felt strong arms lift her and Luro from the snow. Then everything went dark. Rava woke slowly, as if rising from deep water. Her body felt heavy, stiff, almost frozen. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. The last thing she remembered was the storm, the cold biting her skin, and the strange light moving toward her. Now, a warm smell filled her nose. Something burning, but soft and comforting, wood and herbs mixed together. She blinked, her eyes stinging from brightness. She lay on a bed softer than anything she had felt in years, covered in thick blankets that wrapped her like safety itself. Her heart jumped with panic. Luro. She reached to her side, but her hands grabbed nothing. The space beside her was empty. Pain shot through her chest as she sat up, ignoring the sharp aches in her body. She looked around, breath shaking. The room was small but warm. Wooden walls reinforced with metal plates. A lantern hanging from a beam. Strange tools and old human devices scattered across shelves. Everything around her smelled like smoke and survival. Then the door creaked open. A tall human man stepped inside. His clothes were patched. His beard was rough. His eyes looked tired, like someone who had spent too many nights alone. When he saw Rava awake, he stopped, surprised but calm. He raised one hand slowly, not close to her, just enough to show he meant no harm. Rava stared at him, breathing fast, hands trembling. Humans were not trusted by her people. Humans were dangerous. Humans were wild. But this one had saved her. He spoke in a low, steady voice. "Your child is safe." She didn't understand all the words, but she understood the tone. She pointed toward the empty space beside her, fear rising again. The man nodded and stepped aside, pointing toward a second small room behind him. Through the cracked door, Rava saw Luro lying on another bed, wrapped in several thick blankets, his tiny chest rising slowly, but alive. Her breath escaped in a shaky cry. She tried to stand, but her legs failed. She stumbled, and the man moved quickly, catching her before she hit the floor. His hands were strong but gentle, guiding her toward her child. She fell to her knees beside Luro's blankets. Her fingers touched his face again and again. He was still too cold, but warmer than before, his color slowly returning. She pressed her forehead against his and whispered thanks in her own language, her voice breaking. The man stepped back, giving her space, watching carefully in case she fainted again. His eyes were serious but soft. She looked up at him with fear and confusion. Why would a human live out here? Why would he help her kind at all? She tried to speak, but the words from her language meant nothing to him. Still, he seemed to understand her expression. He walked to the furnace in the corner and adjusted a valve. The flame inside rose higher, filling the cabin with more warmth. Then he pointed to himself and spoke slowly. "Found you in the storm." He tapped his chest, almost frozen. Then he pointed at Luro. "I kept him warm." Rava's eyes widened. The human had held her freezing child against his own body to keep him alive. No one on her planet would believe such a thing. Before she could react more, the furnace sputtered with a loud cough. The flame shrank. The man frowned and moved toward a frost-covered window. Snow still drifted outside. The storm hadn't ended. He grabbed a heavy coat from a hook. Rava shook her head desperately, pointing toward the door, trying to warn him. The storm would kill him. But he only said one thing, slowly and clearly. "If the heat dies." He pointed at Luro. "Your child dies too." Her heart sank. The human wrapped a scarf around his neck and stepped outside. Cold wind exploded into the room for a second before the door slammed shut. Rava sat beside her child, listening to the storm scream outside again. She didn't know who this human was. She didn't know why he helped. But now their lives depended on him returning. And the storm outside was growing stronger. The storm outside beat against the cabin walls like a giant fist. Rava sat beside Luro, holding his tiny hand, praying the human would return soon. The room was warm for now, but she could feel the cold slowly creeping in through the wooden cracks. It was like invisible hands trying to steal the heat away. Luro's breathing was still weak. Too weak. His little chest rose and fell like a candle flame fighting heavy wind. Rava brushed snow dust from his forehead and kissed him softly. When she pulled back, she noticed something she had missed before: thin glowing lines under his skin. Soft, faint, like moonlight beneath the surface. Her heart dropped. Those marks only appeared when a child reached the final stage of cold shock. It meant his body was colder than any medicine could fix. Only real heat could save him now. She wrapped him tighter in the blankets, whispering small words in her language. Words about hope, dawn, and survival. The furnace coughed again, a harsh sound, like metal choking. The small flame inside flickered weakly, shrinking until it looked more like dying ember than fire. "No," Rava whispered, her voice shaking. "If the furnace died now, the warmth would vanish. And without warmth, Luro would not last another hour." Just then, the door burst open with a loud crash. Cold wind exploded into the room, blowing snow across the floor. Elias stumbled inside, carrying a metal component covered in frost. His beard was stiff with ice. His cheeks were red, almost purple. His hands were bleeding from tiny cuts, as if he had fought the storm itself. He kicked the door shut behind him and leaned against it, breathing hard. Rava stared at him with wide, worried eyes. He didn't speak. He simply nodded and limped toward the furnace, dropping the heavy metal part beside it. Without resting, he knelt on the floor and began pulling tools from a worn leather pouch. Wrenches, bolts, a cracked thermal patch. His fingers shook from the cold, but he kept working, tightening, removing, fitting, pushing, fixing the heart of the cabin with the determination of someone who had done this 100 times before. But this time the storm was worse. And so was the damage. The flame inside the furnace dimmed again, almost disappearing. Rava gasped and hugged Luro close as if her panic alone could keep him warm. Elias muttered to himself. Short, sharp words she couldn't understand, but his tone was desperate. He hammered the metal pipe with his fist. The sound echoed through the cabin. Then, a spark jumped. The flame burst back to life. Bright, strong, burning with a heat that washed over the room like a wave of hope. Rava exhaled in relief, closing her eyes as warmth touched her skin again. Elias sat back, exhausted, dropping the wrench from his hand. He fell against the wall, letting the heat thaw the ice from his clothes. Rava crawled closer and touched his arm gently. He turned his head, and she saw it. Tired, soft eyes. Eyes that said he had risked his life for her child without a second thought. She pointed at Luro, then at him. Her hands trembled as she placed her palm over her heart. "Thank you." He understood. He nodded once, his face calm, but full of quiet strength. Rava saw him shiver, despite the flame burning stronger now. His clothes were soaked. Snow melted off him, dripping onto the wooden boards. Without thinking, she grabbed a spare blanket and wrapped it around his shoulders. Elias froze, surprised she would care for him. But he didn't push her away. He pulled the blanket tighter, trying to hide his trembling hands. The storm outside suddenly changed. It grew quieter, but not in a peaceful way. The wind no longer howled, it hissed, as if something moved inside it. Rava felt the hairs on her arms rise. Something about the silence felt wrong. Elias noticed it too. He stood slowly, walked toward the window, and pressed his ear against the frame. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then he whispered a single sentence, so softly she almost didn't hear it. "They're close now." Rava stared at him, confused, frightened. Elias turned, his expression serious, almost grim. "Don't let him sleep," he said, pointing at Luro. "If he sleeps now, he won't wake again." Rava hugged her child tightly, feeling her heartbeat pound against his small chest. The storm was no longer their enemy. Something else was coming. Something worse. Something hunting the warmth that kept her baby alive. The storm outside no longer sounded like a storm. It sounded alive. Rava held Luro tightly, rocking him gently to keep him awake. His small breaths were still weak, but warmer than before. She whispered soft words to him, but her eyes kept drifting toward the window, afraid of what waited beyond the frost-covered glass. Elias stood near the door with the metal rod in his hand, listening. He barely breathed. His posture was stiff and alert, like someone who had been hunted before. A sudden, deep thump hit the outside wall. Rava flinched. Snow drifted from the ceiling. Elias didn't move at first. He just closed his eyes for 1 second, as if confirming something he already feared. Then he opened them and whispered, "They found us." Rava didn't understand the words, but the fear in his voice told her enough. She tightened her arms around Luro, pressing him into her chest. Slow footsteps moved around the cabin, slow, heavy steps that crunched the snow with unnatural weight. Whatever it wasn't human. It wasn't like anything she had heard before. Each step sounded like ice cracking under something enormous. "What is it?" she whispered, though she knew he wouldn't understand. Elias glanced at her and then pointed at the furnace, the source of heat. The only light. The only living warmth for miles. "They come for this," he said. He pointed at the flame, then made a clawing motion with his hand. Rava felt a chill crawl up her spine. Another thump. Closer. Heavier. This time, the wall shook so hard that Luro whimpered. Rava covered his mouth quickly, tears burning her eyes. Elias motioned for silence. Absolute silence. The creature moved again, dragging something sharp across the outside wall. The sound was long and slow, like claws pulling through wood and snow at the same time. The scratch echoed through the cabin, making Rava's skin crawl. Elias crouched and moved toward the small corner window, staying low. He wiped a thin patch of frost from the glass with his sleeve. His breath fogged it instantly. He wiped again, carefully, quietly. Then he froze. Rava couldn't see the creature, but she could see Elias's face. His jaw tightened, his eyes widened slightly, and he whispered, "Frost eaters." The name alone made her chest tighten. She had heard distant stories from travelers, creatures that wandered frozen planets, hunting for heat, life, breath. But she thought they were myths meant to scare children into staying inside during winter. Now one stood outside the cabin. A heavy shadow moved past the window. Tall, wrong-shaped, walking low like a predator stalking prey. The scratching stopped. Silence pressed into the cabin again, thick and painful. Rava didn't dare breathe. Then, a loud slam hit the window frame. Hard enough to crack the wood. Hard enough to shake the lantern on the wall. Rava cried out softly before covering her mouth. Elias leaped toward the furnace and lowered the flame instantly, reducing the warmth. The room became cold in seconds. Rava shivered violently, but she understood. Too much heat would only pull the creature closer. The creature sniffed around the window. Heavy breathing fogged the glass from the outside. A low, rumbling growl filled the air. Luro whimpered again, and Rava nearly panicked, covering him with both hands, both blankets, anything to block the sound. Elias moved in front of them, gripping the metal rod tightly. He stood tall, like a wall between the creature and the mother and child. He didn't look like a lone survivor anymore. He looked like a warrior. Another slam hit the wall near the door. Wood splintered. Snow fell from the ceiling. The creature was testing the cabin, searching for weak spots. Rava's heart pounded so loudly she feared the frost eater would hear it. Elias mouthed the word stay. She nodded, swallowing her fear. The steps moved again, circling, dragging, hunting. The creature's claws scraped along the side of the cabin once more, slow, patient, cruel. The sound was worse than screams, worse than the storm. It meant the creature was choosing where to break in. Rava hugged Luro tighter, rocking him gently, whispering a soft prayer. Her hands shook, but she did not stop. Her child needed to stay awake. He needed her voice. Elias stepped closer to the door and braced himself. He pressed his shoulder against it, gripping the rod tight in one hand. His breath came out in slow, controlled clouds. The creature stopped moving. Total stillness fell across the world. Then, a violent slam shook the entire cabin, hitting the door so hard that cracks spread across the frame like spiderwebs. Rava gasped. Elias pushed his weight against the door, boots sliding against the wooden floor as the force outside tried to break in. Another slam. And another. The frost eater knew exactly where the humans hid. Elias shouted something Rava did not understand, but the urgency in his voice made her scramble for anything heavy. She grabbed a wooden storage crate and pushed it with all her strength toward him. Elias kicked it into place in front of the door. The creature slammed again, but the door held. Barely. Elias leaned against it, breath shaking. Rava watched him, her heart breaking with fear and gratitude. The frost eater growled low, frustrated, but it did not leave. Rava realized with horror. This creature would not stop. Not until all warmth in the cabin was gone. Not until they were gone. The door shook under another blow, harder than the last. The wooden frame groaned loudly, bending as if it might snap at any moment. Frost drifted from the ceiling beams. The cabin wasn't built to survive creatures like this. Rava pressed her back against the far wall, clutching Luro tightly. His small body shivered in her arms, but there was a little more strength now, just enough to remind her he was still fighting. His eyelids fluttered. She whispered to him again, desperate to keep him awake. Elias pushed his shoulder against the door, planting both boots firmly. His muscles trembled from the force outside. The metal rod in his hand shook slightly, but his grip stayed strong. Every breath he took came out as a sharp cloud of white mist. Another slam. The crate behind him slid an inch across the floor. Rava's heart hammered painfully. The frost eater growled, a deep, rumbling sound that made the entire cabin vibrate. Rava felt the noise in her bones. She had heard predators before, but nothing like this. This creature didn't hunt for hunger. It hunted for heat, for life, for them. Elias looked back at her for one quick second. His eyes were tired, strained, but calm. A silent message. Hold on. He shoved hard against the door again. The frost eater scraped its claws along the wall, circling, searching for another weak spot. The sound dragged long and slow, like metal being pulled over stone. It made Rava's skin crawl. It felt like the creature was smiling behind the wall. The furnace sputtered. Not again. Rava's breath caught in her throat. Luro whimpered weakly. Elias cursed under his breath and sprinted to the furnace. He grabbed a tool and tightened the side panel, but the flame still flickered dangerously. Cold flowed into the cabin like creeping mist. No. Come on, Elias whispered through clenched teeth. He hit the pipe once, twice, 3 times. A spark flashed. The flame steadied. Warmth returned, but dimmer than before. Rava felt fear rising in her chest. If the furnace weakened again, the creature would sense the change instantly. Warmth was life. Warmth was scent. Warmth was a beacon. The door thumped again, this time on the lower corner. The frost eater was testing new angles, trying to find the exact place where the wood was weakest. Elias ran back, pushing his weight against the cracking frame. The door bent inward slightly. A thin beam of icy air shot through a new crack, hitting his face like a blade. He didn't flinch. Rava noticed something then. The creature wasn't mindlessly attacking. It was thinking, learning, listening. She felt her stomach twist. Outside, the creature paced slowly, its footsteps heavy, its breath loud enough to hear through the walls. Every now and then it sniffed, long, deep drags of air, searching for the warmest point inside. And then it found it. Luro. The creature suddenly stopped. The air in the cabin froze. Even the wind outside seemed to pause. Elias's eyes widened. Rava held her breath. The frost eater slammed itself against the outer wall directly behind Rava. Wood cracked loudly. Dust fell from the ceiling. A long claw punched through the wall, sharp, icy, and searching. Rava screamed and pulled Luro away just as the claw slashed through the air where his head had been. Elias charged across the cabin and struck the claw with his metal rod. Sparks flew as metal hit ice. The creature shrieked, a sharp, unnatural sound that made the lantern flicker. The claw withdrew, but it was not retreating. It was repositioning. The creature slammed the wall again, now harder, splitting the wood in a long vertical crack. Snow burst into the room through the gap. Rava backed away, shielding Luro with her entire body. Her breath trembled violently, but she refused to let go of her child. Elias looked around quickly, analyzing the room with the eyes of a survivor. His gaze locked on the furnace, on the heat, the only thing keeping the creature attached to the cabin. He turned to Rava and pointed frantically to the floor near the center of the room. "Stay there," he said. His tone made the meaning clear. He ran to the furnace and lowered the flame again, almost to nothing. The room became painfully cold. Luro whimpered in her arms. Rava's heart ached seeing him shiver. But the creature hesitated outside. Its heavy footsteps slowed. Its shadow passed by the window again, uncertain, confused by the sudden drop of heat. It sniffed the air, frustrated. Searching, Rava watched Elias through blurry eyes. He stood beside the furnace, one hand on the valve, controlling the heat with precise care. He didn't look like a lonely survivor anymore. He looked like someone who had trained for moments like this. Someone who knew monsters. Someone who refused to let them win. The frost eater slammed the door again, once, sharply, testing. But the heat was no longer strong. Its prey was suddenly harder to pinpoint. It growled one last time, low and angry. Then its footsteps shifted. Not away, not closer, just waiting. The worst kind of danger. Rava realized the truth. This creature wasn't leaving. It was preparing for something bigger. Elias met her eyes and whispered, "This is only the first one." The cabin fell into a quiet, so deep it felt unnatural. Rava could hear nothing but her own heartbeat and Luro's weak breaths against her chest. Elias stood perfectly still near the furnace, watching the door, waiting for the next move. But the frost eater did not strike the door again. It moved above them. A soft thump sounded on the roof. Then another. Then the entire ceiling groaned as something heavy crawled across it. Rava gasped and held Luro closer. Snow dust fell in thin lines from the beams. Elias's face tightened. He looked up slowly, gripping the metal rod with both hands. "It's climbing," he whispered, more to himself than to her. The sound grew louder. The creature's weight pressed down on the wooden boards. Its claws scraped the roof, long, sharp, patient scratches that felt like they were slicing through Rava's nerves. She backed away from the center of the cabin, shielding Luro with her body. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. Only cold, only darkness, only the monster above them. The roof buckled. A long crack split across one of the beams. Snow poured through the gap like white rain. Elias jumped under it, ready to strike. Rava whispered to her child, "Stay awake. Please stay awake." A claw punched through the wood. The long, pale limb thrashed downward, searching blindly for the warmth below. Elias swung the metal rod with all his strength. The impact rang through the cabin like a bell made of ice. The creature shrieked. A horrible, freezing cry that made Rava cover her ears. Elias struck again, and again. Sparks flew where metal hit frozen bone. His arms trembled from the blows, but he kept swinging, his face locked in grim determination. The claw withdrew, but only for a moment. Another crash hit the roof, this time on the opposite side. The beams shook. Snow fell in heavy clumps. The Frost Eater was moving fast now, desperate, angry that its prey dared to resist. Elias ran across the cabin, positioning himself under the next weak spot, ready to intercept. The claw broke through again, bigger this time. Sharper. Elias swung upward, knocking it back. Blood, dark blue and steaming, splattered onto the floor. The creature howled, the sound shaking the entire roof. It leaped off the cabin with a thundering crash that made the lantern swing wildly. Rava felt the ground vibrate beneath her. For a few seconds, there was silence. Then, the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps circling the cabin again. The creature was furious, injured, but not gone. Rava's breath trembled. Elias wiped sweat from his face, though the room was freezing cold. Then the furnace flickered. Again, the flame shrank, dimming to a small glow. Rava's heart clenched as a wave of cold filled the room. Luro whimpered, his glowing lines flashing faintly under his skin like trembling light. No, 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 Elias muttered, sprinting back to the furnace. He tore open the side panel, working faster than Rava had ever seen. His hands shook, not from fear, but from the freezing cold biting through his wet clothes. The creature sensed the drop in warmth. Its footsteps grew faster, closer, hungrier. Rava pressed Luro to her chest, whispering to him again and again, her tears freezing before they hit the blankets. The Frost Eater slammed the wall, testing for weakness. Elias twisted a bolt. Nothing. He adjusted the pipe. Nothing. He hit the heater with his fist. Still nothing. The creature slammed again, cracking the outer boards. The furnace gave a small cough. Then a spark. Then another. Elias closed his eyes and hit the panel one last time. Hum. The flame burst back to life. Tall, bright, angry. Warmth filled the room. Not enough to chase the cold away, but enough to hide Luro's fading glow. Rava let out a shaky breath of relief. The Frost Eater roared, long, furious, defeated, as the flame's heat spread across the snow outside. And then something changed. A faint light appeared through the window. Soft, pink, growing slowly. Elias turned his head sharply. His eyes widened. Dawn, he whispered. Rava looked too, tears filling her eyes as she saw the first edge of sunlight rising beyond the white horizon. The creature outside shrieked, stumbling back into the shadows. It hated the light. It hated heat it could not control. It hated anything that promised life. It slammed the door one last time, a final act of anger, and then retreated, its heavy steps fading into the frozen forest. Elias stood still, metal rod ready, waiting until he heard nothing but the wind. Silence returned. Real silence. This time, it felt like peace. Rava looked at Luro. His color had improved. His breathing was steady, warm. She looked at Elias, who stood trembling from exhaustion and cold. The night was over, but none of them would ever forget it. The first rays of dawn hit the cabin like a gentle blessing. Soft pink light slipped through the cracked window and washed over the wooden floor, melting thin layers of frost one by one. The air inside slowly warmed, not from the furnace alone, but from the rising sun itself. Rava held Luro tightly, her hands shaking with relief. His tiny chest rose with steadier breaths now. His skin, once frighteningly pale, began to show a faint shimmer again, the natural glow of his kind returning. She pressed her forehead to his and whispered a trembling thank you, over and over. Elias didn't move at first. He stood near the door, staring at the fading shadows outside, making sure the Frost Eater had truly left. His body was stiff from the cold, his clothes frozen at the edges, his hands red and raw from gripping the metal rod all night. But he didn't seem to care. He only cared that Rava and Luro were alive. Only when the creature's last distant roar disappeared into the far woods did Elias finally exhale. A long, tired breath. He lowered the metal rod, letting it fall to the floor with a dull thud. Rava watched him with wide, grateful eyes. She didn't know how humans showed thanks. She didn't know the right words. But she knew one thing. This man had fought a monster, the storm, and the freezing night for two strangers he had no reason to protect. She stood slowly, her legs weak but willing. She walked toward him, carrying Luro in her arms. When Elias turned to her, she placed her free hand gently on his arm. He blinked, surprised. Then she took Luro's tiny hand and guided it toward Elias's palm. The baby's fingers curled around the human's cold, scarred hand. It was a small gesture, but it carried meaning deeper than language. You saved us. You are not alone. You matter. Elias stared at the tiny hand gripping his own. He swallowed hard, emotion rising in his chest after a night filled with fear, tension, and survival. He hadn't felt another person's touch in a long time. He certainly didn't expect trust from an alien mother, especially not after what her kind believed about humans. Rava pressed her hand to her heart, a gesture of respect in her culture. He finally understood. He nodded slowly, his eyes softening. For the first time since she had woken in the cabin, Elias allowed a small smile to touch his face. The sun grew brighter. Warmth spread across the cabin walls. Frost melted from the furnace pipes. The terrible cold that had threatened Luro's life now faded into gentle light. Rava walked to the window and looked out at the snowfield. The world that had nearly killed her now glowed gold. The storm had passed. The wind was calm. The tracks of the frost eater were already disappearing under the soft morning light. She whispered to Luro, "We made it. We survived the long night." Behind her, Elias put more wood into the heater, not out of fear anymore, but simply to keep the cabin comfortable. The danger was gone, for now. But Rava felt something new in her heart as she looked at him. She had heard terrible stories about humans. Ruthless, cold-hearted, wild. But this man had saved her child with his own warmth. He had fought a monster alone. He had risked everything for people he didn't even know. That was not ruthlessness. That was courage. That was heart. Elias stood beside her, watching the sunrise too. For a moment, they both stood in silence. Two different species, two different worlds, united by the same moment of peace. Rava looked at him and whispered softly, "You are strong." He didn't understand the words, but he understood the feeling. He nodded once, his voice quiet but steady. "You're safe now." The cabin filled with sunlight, chasing away every shadow of the long night. Rava held Luro close, and Elias stood beside them. No longer a stranger, no longer just a lone survivor. In the heart of the frozen world, three lives that never should have crossed paths were now tied together by fate, courage, and a bond forged in the coldest night. A bond that might one day change more than just their lives. A bond that proved humanity could still shine, even at the edge of a dying world.